91.
It's time for the Russ Belville Show's Cannabis Q&A with Dr. Mitch Earlywine. Dr. Earlywine is a professor of psychology at the State University of New York at Albany and a leading author and researcher on cannabinoids and health, who pins the Ask Dr. Mitch column for High Times magazine. Get your questions ready in our live chat or call in to 971-533-7111 now.
Welcome back, everyone. 1:30, and we're visiting with Dr. Mitch from SUNY Albany. How you doing, Dr. Mitch?
I wish I were moving to Oregon.
I bet you do. I bet you do. I know a Minnesota normal guy who's moving to Oregon and having dinner with him tonight.
Oh, well, give him my very best. I think that's a great move on his part.
Yeah. There's going to be a green rush out here to Oregon. I'm sure of it. Of course, we're talking about the election tomorrow, Measure 91. And Dr. Mitch, as well as being a researcher and author on marijuana, he's the chairman of the NORML board of directors. So this is like, Christmas Eve, New Year's, and 4th of July rolled up into one, isn't it?
I got to admit, I'm actually more excited about this than any of those holidays.
Fantastic. Well, what do you think about the chances as we're going into these into the election tomorrow? I know Washington, D.C. looks like a lock.
I mean, D.C. looks great. Oregon looks great. Keith Strupp wrote a great thing trying to lay things out this morning. But I want to just emphasize the optimism here, and that everybody should go out no matter what the polls say, because we really got an important message to send. And polls have been wrong before. The famous Dewey defeats Truman headline is something I would love to see yet again, so we could hold up some great headlines and tell the pollsters to lump it.
There you go. I think also we had a great youth turnout in 2012 in Colorado and Washington. I think maybe the pollsters underestimate how much marijuana will bring young people to the polls. You teach the young people. You're amongst the youngsters. How are they feeling about this?
In fact, we're having a big voting drive right on campus, and there are more opportunities to vote on campus, and I think that has had a big impact. And so I've done everything but basically offer extra credit for folks to go ahead and vote.
Fantastic, Dr. Mitch. All right, so I want to remind folks you can get your questions in to our chat room. If you got a question on cannabis science, culture, history, or health, get it in or call the number on your screen, 971-533-7111. Like to open up by giving Dr. Mitch the first word on the latest in cannabis science. What's up, Dr. Mitch?
Well, a very cool abstract came out from a bunch of researchers from various areas across the country, including UCSF, basically looking at middle-aged folks and their exposure to marijuana and how it relates to cognitive functioning. And as you might guess, cigarettes are markedly worse, and it turns out that lifetime exposure to marijuana really didn't have any impact on the cognitive functioning in a really large sample, over 3,000 participants. And even having used in the last 30 days only seemed to have a negative consequence for one of a whole host of tests. And to tell you the truth, I think it's a type 1 error. I think it's just a statistical fluke.
All right. Well, good news in that survey. Any flaws with this survey as far as what our
actually,
opponents?
no. This is really well done. A huge sample and reasonable assessments of lifetime use because it's been a longitudinal data set, and good statistical controls for alcohol and illicit drug use. And no surprise that alcohol actually does contribute to the cognitive functioning. So I think all in all, the key thing is to stay healthy and stay away from cigarettes and too much alcohol.
Jeremy Daw writes in the Leaf Online, and he's been covering that trial going on in California where they're getting into the constitutionality of Schedule 1. Dr. Carter spoke, Dr. Carl Hart spoke. Have you been following that trial, and what are some of your thoughts about it?
I've been in touch with everybody and actually been doing a lot of behind-the-scenes work. I was sorry I couldn't go out there myself and testify. It's been extremely impressive. Dr. Carter is, just one of the greatest guys to ever walk the face of the earth. He was super, super detailed in his presentations and made it crystal clear that the notion that Schedule 1 requires no approved medical use is clearly faulty, and that it requires a high addictive potential was also faulty. Dr. Hart echoed that with really consistent use of some of the same references as well as some novel stories and experiences. If you haven't seen Carl Hart, too, he's this wonderful-looking African-American dude with giant, long dreadlocks, and the lawyers were doing everything they could to try to discredit him and had absolutely no luck. they had Dr. Carter up there for 15 minutes trying to get him to fess up to smoking pot, and he literally said, "Hey, I was in college in California in the 1970s." As if this were somehow relevant, though, and I feel like the fact that the attorneys for the other side are grasping at straws like this kind of tells us how hard up they really are to maintain the idea that marijuana belongs in Schedule 1.
I think Dr. Carter's been picking out lines from Newt Gingrich. Wasn't that Newt Gingrich's line? If you were alive in the 70s in college, you had to have smoked pot, something along those lines.
Exactly. And Dr. Carter has markedly fewer divorces than Newt Gingrich.
Yeah, markedly. Don't we all? All right. There's a study that I came across. It was on Halloween of all things. And it really struck me because of how our opponents like to characterize medical marijuana. Oh, they're just getting it for pain. It's just pain. This study says they polled 35,000 American households and found that significant and debilitating pain that endures for 3 months or more is now a common feature in the lives of an estimated 39 million Americans. Overall, 19% of the adults polled were deemed to have experienced chronic and severe daily pain, and that didn't include people that struggled with arthritis, back, or joint pain who only had it, occasionally. Wow, that's pretty amazing.
And it's wild because this is saying a lot about, first of all, how our health care is in general. So we're simultaneously experiencing these rises in pain for reasons that I can hypothesize about, but also incredible pressure to stay away from the opiate meds. So physicians are actually apprehensive about prescribing opiates for fear that they're going to essentially get busted. And we know one of the best ways to keep opiate use down is, of course, to have cannabis as an adjunct treatment. And, in fact, opiates do tend to lead to tolerance and dependence symptoms rather rapidly, so anything we can do to keep those down in the treatment of chronic pain is going to be helpful. Finally, I think it's easy to underestimate how chronic pain can really affect just your individual attention, your everyday functioning. It's really, really outrageous. If you can imagine having a toothache or any other time you've experienced a bad pain and waking up to that every single morning, you have a glimmer of what some of these people are going through, and I feel like this import can't be overestimated.
I'm so glad you mentioned that because one of the authors of the study, I highlighted this quote just because it smacked me upside the head when I read it. He says, quote, and he's referring to the fact that the U.S. consumes 80% of the world's opioids, 99% of the world's hydrocodone. And he says, quote, those medications are wonderful when they work, but on average, they only relieve about a third or less of the chronic pain people experience and may be completely ineffective in treating some kinds of chronic pain. Also, the drugs don't do anything to tackle the emotional, mental, and behavioral aspects of pain management. End quote. I'm thinking, gosh, if only there were some sort of non-addictive pain remedy that also worked well for tackling your mood and emotional state.
I mean, there you have it. Nobody gets an emotional rise out of hydrocodone after about the third day. And fortunately, the tolerance to cannabis is not along those same lines.
Oh, my goodness. It's just amazing. And that stat of using, 80% of the world's opioids, either we're in much more pain than the rest of the world or we're more addicted than the rest of the world. What's the explanation for that?
To tell you the truth, we're in a total lap of luxury. I'm sure any country that could get access to the opioids the way we do would be happy to use them at the rates we do. They simply just don't have the availability.
Okay. Another study that came out recently, this was highlighted on the New York Times, October 29th. This is Your Brain on Drugs. And it was another one of these, Dr. Gilman working at with researchers at Harvard, studying the brains of 20 pot smokers and doing the scans on them, finding evidence of structural differences and so forth. We've talked about these brain scan things before, but did you see this latest one in the New York Times?
Amanda Ryman had emailed it to me, and I mean, they did a reasonable job summarizing. We have to remember that every time they do these scans, they look at literally dozens and dozens of locations. And so every time you look at one, you've got about a 5% chance of finding something. So if you look at 20 different places, of course you're going to find at least one that shows some kind of difference. The fact that it was structural, too, that's a relative rarity. So clearly we've had at least 4 studies I can think of before that's suggested no structural changes, particularly folks who don't start until adulthood. So I'm not going to make too much about any single study, particularly one with a sample size as big as 40.
Yeah. All right. And a couple of quotes here from some of the all-stars. Dr. Volkoff from the National Institute of Drug Abuse says that we're seeing significant increases in ER admissions with marijuana use, and it's because the marijuana is so much more potent these days.
Nora, I don't even know what to say when she talks anymore. What a surprise. You're now allowed actually to say that you've used marijuana when you're at the emergency room without basically getting slapped with an outrageous confrontation with police officers. So people may be more willing to mention that, but I really don't think this has anything to do with the potency of cannabis or the frequency of use.
And then we have a follow-up from Alan J. Budney from Dartmouth Medical School saying that the higher potency accelerates addiction. You don't have to work so hard to get high. Easier to get high means more vulnerable to addiction, which explains why there's so many more tequila alcoholics than beer alcoholics, I guess.
Well, this is now the third school, Alan. I mean, the fact that he moved to Dartmouth was news to me, and he's really making a lot on the marijuana withdrawal and marijuana addictive potential and getting a lot of federal funding for this. So in many ways, this is what he has to say. We do have some data that suggests that stronger concentrates may lead to more tolerance to cannabis, and I think that there's something to be said for that. But you'll notice that nobody sits around and smokes 2 whole joints anymore the way they did in the 70s, and I think actually increased potency just means less exposure to respiratory irritants and smoking less, not these outrageous increased rates in addictive potential. Ironically, the DSM-5 has now changed the definition, so we won't be able to easily compare things to times back in the day, and so I'm really apprehensive about what's going to happen with these new estimates when people try to say, oh, now marijuana is more addictive than it used to be, when in fact the definition of addiction is no longer what it used to be.
Yeah, and that was something Dr. Hart pointed out in those in the trial deposition there, wasn't it? Where the guy came at him with DSM-4 and he said, there's a 5 now.
I just thought that was so elegant. That was perfect.
That's wonderful. All right, folks, we got to wrap things up, but if you've got a question for Dr. Mitch, you can always send it in via email at 420research@gmail.com. I assume you'll be out there on the East Coast staying up late, checking out marijuana returns all night, huh?
I'm actually going to be getting a nap in the middle of the day, so